Earlier this month, on March 7th, in Washington, D.C., investor David Sachs, who has been a guest on our show several times, was in town to receive an award, the third Rail Award by the American Moments Organization. In his acceptance speech, David gave what he called Biden's big backfire, in which he listed four separate things that he views as Biden's mistakes and ways that he could have avoided war, or once the war started, could have mitigated the war and brought it to an end, but has failed. And as a result, there is significant consequence and cost to the United States as the war continues to go on. I want to focus on two of the things he said, because I think it's really important to highlight and to give more visibility on the things he's talking about here, because I don't think enough people are aware of really what's going on. One of the big reasons for this war has always been that the West claims, just for now more than 2 years, you hear that constantly, the unprovoked attack of Putin onto Ukraine. Like there was no good reason for it, like it just came completely out of nowhere. And so, of course, because Putin's evil, therefore we have to go against him, or he's going to be coming for us next. We talk about that a lot, but that is the routine reflexive view of many in Washington, and certainly among the major media, definitely among politicians, most notably the White House. Now, as David talks about here, that you can quibble about whether it was issue or not, whether he was provoked or not, but you can't say that nothing was going on. So, for example, in 2014. During the Maidan revolution. So there was a legally elected government in Ukraine that existed. And in late 2013, there began to be a lot of protests because the legally elected leader was tilted towards Russia. He tilted towards Russia, away from the EU on some economic matters, which angered a lot of the Western Ukrainians. And so they revolted over it. And then they started to overthrow the government. And we came in and we supported the rebels against the legally elected government, which ordinarily we always say the will of the people should rule, and they should be settled at the ballot box, not with bullets, except when they're against Russia, they will support that. Then, of course, there's also the issue of NATO expansion. We continued to press for Ukrainian membership in NATO, continued to say that was coming, even though Russia had already said and had many times said that was a red line specifically for Ukraine. And then we're continuing to go up there. In January of 2022, again, Jens Stoltenberg, the leader of NATO, General Secretary, again emphasized, yes, we are standing by the 2008 Bucharest summit. Ukraine and Georgia will come into NATO at some point. So that seems to be the final trigger that led to this. And then comes the war. Now, the first of the two areas that I want to talk about here that David Sachs mentioned was there was an economic aspect and a military aspect. So I want to take first of all at the economic aspect, because this has been some stuff that we badly misplayed. And instead of harming Russia, it's harming us. So we're going to pick up some of David's speech here when he's, first of all, what he's talking about is the fact that you can argue about whether it was an unprovoked attack or whether it was a provoked attack. But as he adds,
even if you think that all of those things weren't a provocation, I still think that once Biden sabotaged the peace deal that was available there, he became a co-owner of this war. So like I say, it takes two to tango. Putin may have ordered the invasion, but Biden sabotaged the peace. And what I want to talk about is Biden's policy here of deliberately perpetuating this proxy war against Russia. Again, this was not something that fell into his lap as sort of a accidental thing that he didn't have anything to do with. This was a deliberate policy choice.
Now, specifically what he was talking about there was that there was a shot. Now, he could have, as I've talked many times, there were many diplomatic off-ramps that we could have taken prior to February 24th, 2022, that could have prevented war from ever breaking out at all. But we didn't. So then we had what we had. Then a little over a month later, toward the end of March, 1st of April, there was a negotiations hosted by Turkey in Istanbul, in which both sides emerged saying that there was actually the outlines of an agreement that they could, and it looked like we could stop the worst of the war's effects right there at the beginning, but then it was sabotaged. That's one of the things he was talking about in that one. Then he looks at the next opportunity, which actually came later that same year. And just to set the stage for what you'll see here, there was the biggest military successes that Ukraine had in the war up to that point, as it turned out would be the last ones that they had, was that they put pressure on Russia to have to abandon Kherson City in the south. And then they routed a small Russian force that was poorly positioned up in the north in the Kharkiv area and took a lot of territory back. And there was a lot of optimism at the time. But as Sachs pointed out, that was the next chance we had to end the war. And instead, we punted.
And this policy choice, he, I think, obstinately doubled down on the fall of 2022 when Mark Milley said that we should negotiate. This is the high watermark for the Ukrainians. They've accomplished everything they possibly can on the battlefield. This is the time we should really make a deal.
So in case you don't remember that, in case you're wondering, wait, when did Mark Milley say that? He actually did. Didn't get a lot of press in the U.S., but it did get some. And it's incredibly instructive to go back now, knowing what we know happened subsequent to this, to see what Mark Milley actually said in November of 2022.
The probability of a Ukrainian military victory, defined as kicking the Russians out of all of Ukraine, to include what they define or what they claim as Crimea, the probability of that happening anytime soon is not high, militarily. Politically, there may be a political solution where politically the Russians withdraw. That's possible. You want to negotiate from a position of strength. Russia right now is on its back. The Russian military is suffering tremendously. Leaders have been, their leadership is really hurting bad. They've lost a lot of casualties, killed and wounded. They've lost, I won't go over exact numbers because they're classified, but they've lost a tremendous amount of their tanks and their infantry fighting vehicles. They've lost a lot of their fourth and fifth generation fighters and helicopters and so on and so forth. The Russian military is really hurting bad. So you want to negotiate at a time when you're at your strength and your opponent is at weakness. And it's possible, maybe, that there'll be a political solution. All I'm saying is there's a possibility for it. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, bear in mind, he is the principal military advisor for the President of the United States. General Milley, at that moment, very accurately said, here is the military situation. Russia's on their back foot. They just got spanked in the south and in the north in the Kharkiv area. They are at their weakest here. But he also knows that Russia had just announced a major mobilization of 300,000 troops, and they started to rebuild what they had. They had started to go into the defensive, and they started to build elaborate belts of defensive systems throughout the Ukraine. Milley knew what that was going to mean. And Russia didn't just mobilize those 300,000. They used a lot of those to plug gaps and threw some of them right into combat with little or no training. But they took a big chunk of those and they started training up large formations that they would then use later. They simultaneously started a recruitment drive to where they tried to get more people to join. As it turned out, it was wildly successful. And they began to add upwards of 10,000 per week of people willing to sign up. Those numbers actually increased when it became clear that Russia was having success on the battlefield. Milley knew right then that this was going to be the low water mark for Russia, and it was going to be the high water mark for Ukraine. That was the absolute best time for Kiev to initiate a negotiated settlement from which they would have positive outcomes, and they would have the advantages, or at least more than they would have before. Now, they should have done it in March and April of 2022 of that same year. They didn't. That's where they could have had the best deal. Now it's not going to be as good, but they can still have a pretty good negotiating hand. So he had to have told President Biden that. That's his job. He's the principal military advisor. He said that in public. So now that we know what he said in public, so additional things he certainly said in private. So the question's got to be asked, why did Biden not take that? Why did Biden not encourage that? Instead, now Zelensky was the opposite because he was thrilled with what had happened. And now he's thinking that they're on a roll and are going to keep going. He's apparently oblivious to the combat and military realities, how combat power is made national. And he couldn't see where this was going, or else he ignored it. I can't speak for that. I don't have any knowledge about that part. But it doesn't matter because Biden did. He did know it at that time in November of 2022 by his senior four-star general. So that was the best place. And just imagine him sitting there and someone telling you this is your best chance. And instead Biden said no. So now then you see that's the baseline from which David Sachs is then going to talk about, his 4 backfires that Biden hid. This is going to be one of the big ones. But one of the first things that Biden did was make things messy on the economic front. And I'll just tell you, you can't fight a war unless you have a good economic base from which to operate. Here's what happened.
I want to compare now. I want to take you back to the claims that Biden made 2 years ago at his State of the Union and what he set up was going to happen compared to what's actually happened. I know a lot of you agree with me on this, but hopefully I can I know a lot of you guys work in policy on Capitol Hill. Maybe I can give you some reminders and arguments about how this started and where we are now. Biden's first claim about his policy was economic. He claimed that the sanctions regime would crush the Russian economy, and this would force Russia out of the war and perhaps even precipitate regime change.
Yeah, you may remember that famous time when Biden was in Poland, to where he ad-libbed toward the end and said, "My God, that man can't stay in office." So that's actually, his aspiration, which was certainly received in Moscow. I assure you that Putin got that message loud and clear that they were after him. So, of course, that's going to make him do the opposite of make a negotiated settlement or quit. It's going to make him fight all the harder. But to get to, so you can see exactly what Biden said. Sachs is talking about what Biden said at the 2022 State of the Union address when he first made those statements. Let me show you exactly what Biden said and what he promised was going to happen.
Putin's latest attack on Ukraine was premeditated and totally unprovoked. He rejected repeated efforts at diplomacy. He thought the West and NATO wouldn't respond. He thought he could divide us at home, in this chamber, in this nation. He thought he could divide us in Europe as well. But Putin was wrong. Together, along with our allies, we are right now enforcing powerful economic sanctions. We're cutting off Russia's largest banks from the international financial system, preventing Russia's central bank from defending the Russian ruble, making Putin's $630 billion war fund worthless. We're choking Russia's access. We're choking Russia's access to technology that will sap its economic strength and weaken its military for years to come.
Okay, so he's going to weaken the Russian military for years to come. He's going to choke their economic progress as a country. So he's going to bring it to its knees. And then, of course, he added there at the first, I just had to include that. And so you'd see it for yourself, this totally unprovoked attack. So again, that's the only evil people do that. It's not like NATO expansion had anything to do with it. It's not like our support for the side that undercut the legally elected government. Those things don't have anything to do with it. Totally unprovoked, but still, just don't worry about that part. But now then, we're going to do all these economic sanctions, bringing Russia to its knees. Well, let's go back to David Sachs to see how that worked out.
What we saw, in fact, is that the dislocation to Russia's economy was very short-lived. The ruble had a spike, but then it stabilized. And similarly, the Russian economy, after having a small blip in 2022, started performing very well again in 2023. The data from the IMF, which is shown on this chart, shows that the Russian economy actually outperformed the G7 economies in 2023, and they predict the same for 2024. So this idea that somehow we're going to crush the Russian economies completely, Backfire didn't work at all.
So can you let that sink in for a second? You saw the boisterous applause and Biden thunderously telling people that, these crushing economic sanctions was going to bring Russia to its knees. And the opposite happened. Instead, it's the European Union economies that collapsed, or didn't collapse, but shrank and went backwards. And then not only did Russia not go to its knees, it rose higher. They have better economic performance and better economic output, and they have clearly no shortage of technology, and their military is now stronger than it was, not weaker. Their economy is stronger than it was, not weaker. Our economy is limping along, the U.S. in particular. We barely have any kind of growth, but less than Russia does. Germany, the economic anchor of Europe, actually went into a recession. And in large measure, it was because they lost access to the cheap energy that they had been getting from Russia, with which they built their economic output. The famous German industrial, it was based on having the inputs of cheap energy. So now then they have more expensive energy because they did get that part replaced from the United States. So that worked out well for us because we got to sell more things. You leave that to you to decide whether that was part of the plan or not, but it sure didn't work out for Germany. So they now went into a recession, and we'll see how they perform and if they can pull out in the coming year. But I assure you that's a big issue for them. So on the economic front, Biden's claims that we were going to weaken Russia and strengthen our side backfired completely. Now let's look at the military aspect, because you already know, since this war is now starting into its third year, that part didn't go well either. But let's look at the specifics.
The Biden administration believed and said that it could exhaust Russia and weaken Russia. This was the term that Lloyd Austin used at the very beginning of the war, is that we're going to weaken Russia so it can't invade any of its neighbors again. We're going to knock them out of the ranks of the great powers. This was the big claim of the administration. And frankly, I don't want to just bash on the Biden administration here. A lot of Republicans agreed that this idea of weakening Russia was a, quote, good deal for the U.S. A lot of our swamp senators said that this was either the government's number one priority, or, Lindsey Graham said this is the best money the U.S. has ever spent, the best money ever. So a lot of Republicans bought into this idea that we were weakening Russia on the cheap because we didn't have to do any of the fighting.
And I couldn't help thinking there, the swamp senators, and certainly Lindsey Graham is this poster child for that. He was in Ukraine just a couple of days ago, actually encouraging them to continue to throw their men into the meat grinder and even go younger, get younger people. The people that Ukraine is going to eventually, whenever this does end, they're going to need to rebuild their country and provide a future. He's like not worried about that. Just keep throwing them into the meat grinder. But we'll come back and talk more about that on another occasion. But the bottom line is here, we keep saying we're going to weaken Russia by what we're doing here and make their military get weaker and weaker. That was what Austin said, as he pointed out there. But that's not how it's turned out, has it? Because now that, in fact, the opposite is turning out. Just like with economics, the opposite has turned out, that Russia is now stronger militarily than they were before. So they have entire new classes of drone systems. They are now cranking out massive quantities, domestically produced, of artillery shells. They actually have a large number of artillery shells and missiles and drones from allies, North Korea and Iran. So before the war, those guys were all separate. They weren't working together. Now they're directly coordinating with Russia. So let that sink in too, because now that one of the unanticipated consequences of our actions to weaken Russia has strengthened them and their alliance systems. And of course, you've probably seen some of the news of late, and we've covered a little bit here, to where the China, North Korea, and Russia, and sometimes with also with Iran, are having joint naval exercises as well. So they continue to work more and closely together. Russia has the domestic capacity to continue building more airplanes, to be building more armored vehicles, to repair those that they have, because they have the system for it. They have a logistics system. They can continue fighting this war for a long time. So they are now getting much stronger. But let's see how it worked out on the other side.
So again, this is backfire number 2, is that Biden's proxy war is supposed to weaken Russia militarily. Instead, it's made Russia stronger in really every way militarily, while depleting our own stockpiles. This is really a huge disaster for the United States.
So let's look at that next part he talked about here, depleting the stockpiles in the United States. This is a CSIS chart, which David actually published on his Twitter account here recently. And this just shows you some of the things that the U.S. government has been telling you that actually John Kirby did the other day. He said, yeah, this is not a problem. It's something we're watching, but it's not a problem for our own inventories, really. Because here's what the numbers actually are. Look at those I've circled up there. You see the 155 millimeter, this is on the surge capacity, meaning this is when we're really kicking things into high gear. To just replace what we've given so far will take about 5 years. The Javelin missiles, also about 5 years to replace them. And then look down there at the bottom of the Stingers, the Stinger missiles, that's the anti-aircraft missiles, between 6.5 and 18 years, depending on how fast we can get things ramped up there. So that's if the war ended today, right now, then that's how long it would take us just to replace what we have. But it's not just the United States, it's also NATO, as you can see in this headline here. This was from a year ago. This was from last summer, July of last summer. Both the US and NATO grapple with critical ammo shortages. Now, does that sound like that we're getting stronger when, close to a year ago, we were already running into shortages? You see there, it's going to take multiple years for us to just recover. Now, where does anybody think that this $60 billion that we're talking about given to Ukraine right now, which so many people say is critical to the winning the war, is not going to be a drop in the bucket? It's not going to hardly do anything. You see that if we gave everything we had, all of our production to Ukraine, it's not going to be enough. I think it's $1 point something million, 1 point something million shells, by the end of this year. The Czech Republic allegedly came up with 800,000, which they scrounged from around the world. We'll see if they actually produce it. That's what they promised. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that every one of those shells has materialized soon. So now then that number is 2 million shells instead of 1.2. Well, that still leaves you at 4.5 million on the Russian side. And of course, if they continue to get those from North Korea, that could be another couple of million. So no matter how you want to count it, it will never be enough. And that then means that this 5-year window that you saw in that CSIS report doesn't start. Because if we're giving everything away we have to Ukraine, which won't change the outcome of the war, that means our stocks remain depleted. And look, there's one of the best ways, or one of the most important things that we should recognize from this war so far is that when you get into wars with major powers, it really gets down into an attritional warfare. There's an article that was out in the RUSI, Royal Services Uniformed Institute, I believe it is, a couple of days ago by Alex Vershinin, which we're going to be diagramming with Doug McGregor next week. You're not going to want to miss that. He has written an exceptional piece that analyzes how major modern wars are fought. We think too many times of like Desert Storm, 100-hour ground war, or 2003 Iraqi Freedom, which was about a month of ground operations. And we want to say that's the norm. Well, that's only the norm if you're going against somebody who's extremely weak and doesn't have basically an Air Force or a Navy. Those things are possible here. But when you go against anything close to being a peer adversary, like the Russia-Ukraine war, then it gets into an attritional situation. In those cases, large maneuver and stuff and things that you want to do for a quick outcome don't happen. It doesn't work. The side that can maintain the manpower pool and maintain the production on its weapons and ammunition is the side that's going to win. Well, guess what, folks? Our ammunition stockpiles are at probably all-time lows, or at least since the end of the Cold War. That's a fact. And you see that right now with our capacity the way it is, it'll take us 5 years from the date that this war ends to get back to where we were before. If we should get drawn into a war, we do not have the capacity to match what Russia is doing, for example, or what China could do. They are clearly aware of this, and their industrial capacity is substantially greater than ours. So we have been, out of trying to harm Russia, backfired on us economically. It backfired on us militarily. We have given away several opportunities to end the war. We gave away opportunities to prevent the war from coming. We gave away at least 2 opportunities in 2022 to end the war with negotiated settlement when it could have been relatively good for the Ukraine side. And now that instead of recognizing patent reality that the balance of power is decisively shifted on the Russian side, there is no path to a Ukrainian victory by any definition, period. Now or later. They don't have the manpower, they don't have the equipment, they don't have the ammunition, all those things. So it is irrational to the highest degree to say we're still going to not recognize the truth and we're still just going to blindly go forward, even though economically it's cost us, even though militarily it's cost us by making Russia stronger and us weaker. Now, what sense does it make for the President of the United States to continue down a policy course that weakens ourselves and strengthens our adversaries and puts us at a vulnerable spot should we find ourselves in a war against any of the other major powers? It's absurd and crazy to the highest degree. And yet, folks, that's where we are today. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this today. And I wanted to highlight what David Sachs was talking about there, because not enough people can hear that message. We need to get this out there more. Now, many times I've asked you to, say, hey, do what you can, make comments on other people's shows. Go when people make these comments and other tweets, whatever, tell them the truth here. Well, let me add something to you. Take this show, this one right here, tag it, and send it to everybody that you know, especially those people who were talking about how we have to, help Ukraine and Russia can't win. We can't allow it. And we have to keep going on. We need money. That's nonsense. Send this to your representative. Send this to your congressman, your senator. Send it to your mayor, for crying out loud. I don't know, anybody. Send it just so that people can see these are facts, folks. This is not just me ranting and giving a personal opinion on things. This is born out of someone who has direct combat experience in high intensity warfare, trained other forces to do it, and studies this and shows you facts on the ground where what I'm saying is objectively true. Our enemy is stronger today because of our policies, and our armed forces are weaker today because of our armed forces. We need to stop both of those trends dead in their tracks right now before we ever get put to the test and have to prove how bad things have gotten. That's your deep dive for today, folks. We appreciate you coming on. Be sure and like and subscribe to this. That's one of the ways that we can amplify this message. The more likes we get, the more YouTube thinks, oh, people like this, so they want to send it to others. Other people deserve to see what you do because we remain unintimidated and uncompromised. And we will see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.